In today's video, you will learn the French defense, one of the most solid and dependable openings in chess. But first, should you even switch to the French defense if you've been playing pawn to e5 so far? The beauty of this opening is that it protects you from early game disasters. Typically, white plays pawn to d4, and you respond with pawn to d5, directly challenging the pawn on e4. Notice something important. In the French defense, it becomes impossible for white to bring the bishop to c4, a move they frequently rely on in the Italian game and other classical e5 openings. From c4, that bishop usually attacks the vulnerable f7 square. Think of the scholar's mate, the fried liver attack, the alien gambit, and similar traps. But in the French defense, you have completely blocked off that weakness. Your king and your entire position become far more secure. In this video, my goal is to teach you the essential plans and typical setups so you truly understand how to play the French defense. You will naturally forget many of the specific variations we cover, and that's okay. Once you grasp the underlying principles, the moves will come naturally. Since you are pressuring white's pawn on e4, they have three main responses. Pawn to e5, the advance variation, the most popular choice. Pawn takes d5, the exchange variation, simple and straightforward. Knight to c3, supporting the e4 pawn, leading to the classical lines. These are the key options. Let's begin with the advance variation, the most popular option for white. Like any move, it has both strengths and weaknesses. The obvious benefit is that by pushing the pawn to e5, white gains extra space. This advance pawn controls important squares in your half of the board, making development a bit more difficult. For example, your knight can no longer develop to its usual square, and your dark squared bishop is also restricted. In this sense, the pawn on e5 cramps your position. However, this extra space comes with a cost. By pushing the pawn forward, white slightly overextends. Their pawns are now closer to your forces, which makes them easier targets. On top of that, white is still undeveloped. Their pieces are not yet positioned to support this ambitious pawn advance. This gives you a clear strategic idea: counterattack the center immediately. That is why your main reply is pawn to c5, putting direct pressure on white's center and trying to break down the entire pawn chain. Notice what happens if white captures on c5, which they should not do. If pawn takes c5, they only help you bring your bishop into the game quickly, and once that bishop develops, the pawn on e5 becomes weak and difficult for white to defend. It will become a long-term problem. Because of this, white usually avoids capturing on c5. The correct and most common move for them is pawn to c3, reinforcing their structure and helping maintain the strong pawn chain they created. But many of your opponents will not know the correct theory and will instead play something like knight to f3, which looks like a natural developing move. However, in this position it is actually a mistake because it allows you to capture on d4 and immediately break white's pawn chain. When white recaptures, it may appear harmless. And if white recaptures with the queen, that is even worse, because you can respond with knight to c6, gaining a tempo by attacking the queen. Therefore, knight takes d4 is usually their best recapture. Now you continue with knight to c6, putting pressure on the pawn on a5. Sometimes white tries to reinforce that pawn with pawn to f4, but this has serious drawbacks. It weakens the king, especially along the diagonal. Your queen or bishop can quickly enter that diagonal, making white's king position uncomfortable and even preventing white from castling safely. So the move f4 creates more problems than it solves. Typically, as you attack the pawn on e5, white will exchange on c6, thinking it is the simplest solution. In the short term, this seems to secure their e5 pawn, but in the long run, the position actually favors you. You gain a semi-open file for your rook, your central structure becomes even stronger with the additional pawn ready to advance, and the pawn on a5 still remains a long-term target. Most opponents underestimate these factors, but they add up very quickly in your favor. Your opponents will often think the position is completely normal, but this is where you can turn the game around very quickly. Since the pawn on e5 is becoming weaker, you can immediately increase the pressure with queen to c7, directly targeting that pawn. If your opponent tries bishop to f4 to defend it, you respond with rook to b8, and now you are attacking the other central pawn, the pawn on b2, which is no longer protected by the bishop. If white tries to defend again, you can simply develop your bishop, and now you begin exploiting the weakened diagonal toward the king. As soon as white moves the queen to protect the knight, you reinforce your pressure, and white's position collapses. This shows how fast you can seize control if your opponent makes natural-looking moves without understanding the French defense structure. This is precisely why white must preserve their pawn chain with pawn to c3. After that, you develop your knight, adding more pressure to the central pawn. The correct response for white is a symmetrical developing move like knight to f3, which both develops a piece and adds protection to the pawn on e5. However, many opponents, especially beginners, will instead play bishop to b5. At first glance, it looks strong. It pins your knight and seems to stop that knight from increasing pressure on the center. But bishop to b5 is actually a mistake for several reasons. First, the bishop ideally belongs on d3, where it would be much more active and could aim toward your future castling position on the kingside. By going to b5, the bishop is misplaced and white loses important coordination. Second, when the bishop moves to b5, it actually becomes a target. A simple and powerful trap begins with bishop to d7, which looks like you are merely breaking the pin on your knight. But after almost any reply from white, you suddenly capture the pawn on a5. If white recaptures that pawn, you take the bishop on b5, and from that square your bishop controls the key diagonal, often preventing white from castling, while you also gain material. If instead white captures your bishop with pawn takes d7, you never recapture with the queen, because that would lose your knight. Instead, you take back with the knight, saving the piece and keeping perfect coordination. An even stronger idea is queen to a5. From this square, your queen attacks the bishop on b5 and also pins the pawn on c3, so white cannot recapture on c5. Forced to react, white usually takes on c6, not realizing this is good for you. After the exchange, you gain a semi-open file for your rook, a powerful diagonal for your bishop, a reinforced center, and white loses their most active attacking piece. White ideally wanted their light-squared bishop on d3 to support future kingside attacks, so trading it off on c6 actually gives you several positional advantages. After that exchange, many players continue with another passive move such as bishop to d2, trying to relieve the pin, but this only worsens their position. You now play bishop to a6, immediately exploiting the weakened diagonal. In the French defense, this bishop is often considered your bad bishop because it sits behind your pawn chain. But here it becomes one of your strongest pieces, cutting across the board and preventing white from castling. White must often play knight to a2 just to block the diagonal and survive. At this point, you continue developing. Since you cannot develop your knight normally, white's pawn on a5 would capture it, you use a typical French defense maneuver, rerouting the knight toward f5, a powerful square that places direct pressure on the center. Even if white manages to castle, playing knight to f5 gives you a comfortable and active position. However, you have an even stronger continuation available, queen to b5. From this square, your queen immediately increases the pressure by targeting the knight on e2, and she also creates the tactical threat of capturing the rook on f1 if that knight ever moves out of the way. If white tries to reinforce their position instead of addressing the threat directly, you can simply take the pawn on b2, gaining material and opening lines. This is the spirit of the French defense. You maintain a solid structure while taking advantage of your opponent's weaknesses, winning their pawns and pieces rather than sacrificing your own. White's pieces are so cramped that they cannot avoid losing material. Whether you capture the rook or force them to give up the knight to save it, you emerge with a winning position.